in other cities. It was to support our community colleges on a local level, and they certainly do need our support. Okay, I would like to introduce to you the moderator of this panel, Charles Chapman. He is a former Wall Street executive and a friend of the fair.
Thank you, Barbara. Our panel today consists of 4 prominent, impassioned journalists who cover the Middle East and the war on terror. Chris Hedges is no stranger to longtime readers of the New York Times. After several years in the Middle East, he went to Sarajevo in 1995. His byline was a staple of page 1 throughout the Bosnian tragedy. Later, he was part of the Times team that received the Pulitzer Prize for coverage of global terrorism. His book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, was a National Book Award finalist. His complete, uncompromising, and utter condemnation of war has unsettled more than a few commentators. Co-authoring Collateral Damage is Layla Al-Arian. A graduate of the Columbia School of Journalism, she has written for UPI and Huffington Post. Her father is Sami Al-Arian, former professor at the University of South Florida. Jane Mayer has been an investigative reporter for over 20 years. After stints at the Washington Star and the Wall Street Journal, she became a staff writer for the New Yorker in 1995. Her previous books examined the second term of President Reagan and the Clarence Thomas nomination, which she explores the topics, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. Her recent focus has been the war on terror, and particularly the role of Vice President Cheney. With her new book, The Dark Side, she explores the topics of anti-terrorism, torture, and extreme rendition in chilling detail. Our third book, by Jonathan Mahler, is a man who has covered many topics in his career while writing for the New York Times Magazine. His previous book, Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning, was adapted as a miniseries for ESPN, perhaps something to run when the sprockets ran out on the famous Colts-Giants NFL championship game. His new book, The Challenge, Hamdan versus Rumsfeld and the Fight Over Presidential Power, examines the war on terror from a high-profile case of Osama bin Laden's driver. We'll hear from each of the authors in turn, then there'll be a discussion and a question and answer period. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to speak just briefly about the Iraq War, the type of war it is, and why it has engendered such high numbers of civilian casualties, which of course propelled Lael and I into this 7-month investigation where we interviewed 50 combat veterans from Iraq about civilian atrocities that they either witnessed or in several cases participated in. Layla is going to give you sort of the nuts and bolts of how we did it, how we broke the book down, and why we did it the way we did. I've spent 20 years of my life overseas covering various conflicts, starting with the civil war in El Salvador, where I spent 5 years, on to the Middle East, where I spent 7 years. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, and then, as you heard, the Balkans. Of course, in between, there were very few conflicts that I missed, from the Punjab to the civil war in Algeria, to the 1989 famine and war in the Sudan, Yemen, the list goes on. And if you take war as a generic form, I think you can break it down into 3 different types of conflicts, all of which I've covered. One is essentially the civil wars that I covered in Central America in the early 1980s. These would be Nicaraguan fighting Nicaraguan, Salvadoran fighting Salvadoran, Guatemalan fighting Guatemalan. And then you have what, of course, are becoming rarer and rarer, are set pieces between large mechanized armies. This is what I covered in the first Gulf War, and I'm not at all blind to the severe loss of innocent civilian life in southern Iraq because of the saturation bombing. Indeed, I was in the uprising in Basra after the war until I was captured by the Iraqi Republican Guard. I like to say I was embedded with the Iraqi Republican Guard for 8 days. And, but that took place in essentially open desert where very few civilians, at least at the moment that coalition forces moved into Kuwait, that began. There were very few civilian casualties from that clash. And then you have what we have in Iraq. And that is essentially a colonial occupation. It is the imposition of a foreign force coming in from the outside and trying to impose its will by force. And these conflicts are always the bloodiest. And I think engender the highest degree of civilian casualties. Because when you have outside forces coming in, and I have seen this, whether in Gaza with the Israeli forces or in Iraq with American forces, they're culturally, historically, and linguistically illiterate. The only language they have to communicate with those they are trying to subdue and control is force. And you are surrounded by a hostile population and fighting an elusive enemy who you rarely see, but who can inflict very deadly casualties, whether through IEDs, whether through ambushes that are set up, but that can melt back into the population. And Robert J. Lifton, when he studied the conflict in Vietnam, the great psychiatrist, he called these kinds of conflicts atrocity-producing situations. And he argued that in these kinds of conflicts, where you were battling an enemy, a shadowy enemy, and remember that U.S. soldiers and Marines can go through an entire year of occupation in Iraq and virtually never see the people that are killing and wounding comrades within their units. There becomes a very short psychological leap between that hostile population and the enemy itself, until you carry out attacks against unarmed innocents and no longer make as a revenge attacks and no longer make a distinction between those civilians who are killed and the enemy that you're fighting. And this is the conflict that we have now employed in Iraq, and I would not hesitate to say Afghanistan. And in these kinds of conflicts, essentially what you have is indiscriminate use of heavy firepower. I mean, I'm sure there are probably several people here who have been in the military, and in some ways you have to have been in the military, you have been in the conflicts, to understand how potent the weapons being employed in densely populated urban areas are. SAWs, these are light 7.62 machine guns, belt-fed machine guns, 50 calibers, automatic grenade launchers. These are not weapons that are designed to be used where there is a large civilian population. And yet, whether it's convoys sort of charging these freight trains of death moving down highways, whether it's units laying down suppressing fire after an IED goes off, these kinds of weapons and their indiscriminate use in Iraq are a daily occurrence for most Iraqis, which is why the numbers of Iraqi dead are so massive. Whether it's the Lancet study at 600,000, latest which was done 2-3 years ago, and latest estimates run now perhaps 1 million. 1 million innocent Iraqi dead. And that kind of narrative, even for those of us opposing the war, is very difficult to accept. And before I turn it over to Layla, I will say that, when we did this, and she'll talk about how careful we were about doing it, but when we did it, it had exactly the reaction that took place after Winter Soldier in 1981 when Vietnam veterans came back. John Kerry made a cameo appearance in this film and spoke honestly about Vietnam and Detroit. It caused a huge sensation in Europe and was virtually unseen and unheard here. because it defied that mythic narrative of our boys, and it was just too unpalatable for Americans to digest. In fact, The Nation is publishing a year-long investigative piece about a particular operation that took place in Vietnam where one of the people they quote said, we did a My Lai a month. And that's the reality of the ground on Iraq. And when we published our piece, this is an expanded version of the investigative piece we did, 15,000 words. It was the whole issue of The Nation magazine a year and a half ago. The Guardian newspaper in London reprinted the entire 15,000 words. I mean, almost unheard of for a foreign publication to pick up and devote that much newspaper space to a report that was not their own. The Independent was not far behind, BBC, and yet here within the United States, with the exception of a column by Bob Herbert, it was virtually ignored, and I think for much the same reason. And now Layla will explain to you what we did and why.
Good afternoon. Hi. Well, as Chris mentioned, the numbers are staggering. The latest figure of Iraqi civilian casualties by a British polling agency is 1.2 million. That means by the end of 2006, 5,000 Iraqis were being killed by U.S. forces a month. Now, the Associated Press in February 2007 asked Americans how many Iraqis they think were killed since the beginning of the war. Their answer was 10,000. So you can see that there's a huge gap between the reality and what Americans think is happening in Iraq. Part of that is the censorship that Chris mentioned. And in fact, the story of Iraqi civilian casualties made Project Censored's #1 most censored story in the media. And this, I should say that as far as I know, this one figure of 1.2 million has never been reported in the mainstream media. And that was the reason why we set about to do this, to report and write Collateral Damage, because we wanted to know how Iraqis were being killed, what it is about the mechanics and the day-to-day life in Iraq, the mechanics of the occupation and war that results in the frequent killing and daily abuse of civilians. So what we did was we contacted different veterans organizations, and we talked to 50 Iraq War veterans, men and women who served there all over the country, and we tape recorded these interviews. And for some, it was a cathartic experience, but for others, it really took tremendous moral courage to come forward and talk about these incidents. And we ended up dividing the book into 4 major categories of flashpoints of violence in Iraq: the convoys that travel of speeds of 60 miles an hour, turning on the wrong side of the road, blocking roads, ramming into Iraqi vehicles, going over sidewalks. And the reason these convoys exist and are necessary is they're the arteries that sustain the occupation. They're vehicles of 20 to 30 that drive in a sequence, and they do so for the protection of the U.S. troops at the expense of the Iraqi civilian. So what the troops told us is they were told by their own commanders, if an Iraqi civilian disrupts a convoy, they're allowed to shoot and no questions will be asked. And soldier after soldier, Marine after Marine told us that none of these incidents that they witnessed or participated in were investigated. So this figure of 1.2 million can even be an underestimate considering how many incidents happened that were never reported. I should also mention, in addition to these convoys, there's patrols, daily patrols in neighborhoods. Before February 2007, there were about 1,000 patrols that went out into Iraqi neighborhoods. Now they're up to 5,000. When you have heavily armed soldiers who are afraid for their own lives, who encounter roadside bombs and ambushes and other threats, they're going to respond with force, and that's what happens. And what we were told is not only are these incidents not reported, sometimes they're covered up. So you have so-called throwaway guns, which is, in the cases of some Marines and soldiers, they carry extra AK-47s and bomb-making materials that if they kill a non-combatant, an unarmed Iraqi, sometimes they plant on the bodies of these innocents. And we heard of a story by a Sergeant Patrick Campbell who said he witnessed 2 snipers shooting 50 to 60 rounds into 2 Iraqi men, and he actually saw them planting radios in the cars of these men, and he actually showed us the photographs of them doing that. So we know this happens. Checkpoints similarly have this kind of impunity where the soldiers are told, you know, they told us the common attitude was better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6, meaning they'd rather risk court-martial than risk their own death. In other words, better to kill than be killed, and that's the attitude that prevails. And for that reason, a lot of times if an Iraqi accidentally passes a poorly marked checkpoint, which a lot of them are very poorly marked, we were told, they're liable to be shot and killed, no questions asked. And Sergeant Dustin Flatt told us the story in January 2005 in Mosul of an elderly Iraqi couple driving through a checkpoint, and it was very poorly marked in his words. He said some spooked soldiers shot it up, and their corpses lay there for 3 days, and he said we passed by them day after day, and finally the people in the town buried the couple. And we heard so many stories like this. Raids are also a very common occurrence in Iraq. These patrols we talked about, the 1,000 patrols, each of them raids about 30 Iraqi homes a night. So you'd be hard-pressed to find a single Iraqi family that hasn't experienced the terror of a home raid, where soldiers break down doors, they separate the men from the women, and oftentimes arrest any military-age man in the area. And these stories that the soldiers are coming back are haunting them, and a lot of them broke down as they recounted these. Finally, we also looked at the overall racism against Arabs and Muslims in the military, and the fact that these acts of violence we mentioned are made easier when there's a prevailing attitude of racism. The word Haji is commonly used to disparage and denigrate Iraqis. It's a word that actually is a term of veneration in Arab culture, meaning someone who made the pilgrimage to Mecca, but it's now being used as a slur in the military. And what the troops told us is it's used by the highest commanders, and it's actually encouraged to dehumanize the Iraqis and to make this type of abuse more acceptable. And what I want to say finally is that occupation not only destroys the people who are occupied, it destroys the occupiers. And my fear is that we still haven't come to terms with the long-term effects and consequences of this occupation. So many of the soldiers we talked to told us they had thoughts of suicide. In fact, veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan are 2 to 4 times more likely to take their own lives than veterans of other wars. So I think in addition to doing the moral thing of paying reparations to the Iraqi people, of coming to terms of the devastation that we've caused in that country, we also have to acknowledge the long-term effects on our own troops. And I just wanted to end with something that was told to me by Specialist Josh Middleton of New York, who told me he's had thoughts of suicide since returning. And he said, a lot of things really make sense when you're doing them over there. But when you come back, it's like, how did I do that? It's just like a totally different world. Everything is kind of muted, and I'm never really happy. I don't really enjoy things. I just feel hopeless and listless. I don't fit in with other kids my age. It's really hard to relate to anyone, he said. I want more than anybody else to find a meaning to my experience over there, and something good to feel about, but I just can't find it.
Hi, thanks very much for coming this afternoon. In case the thought of suicide is not dreary enough, I'm here to talk to you about torture. And about how the United States in fighting terror really violated its own values, and what happened when that happened, which is my book is called The Dark Side, and it follows this history. And the first thing I wanted to say about the book is that, you know, I think it's, unlike some writers who probably feel great about what they've written, I think it's a tremendous shame that I had to write this book. And it's not just a shame because I sat at home for more than a year and gained 10 pounds, and also got carpal tunnel syndrome and sort of half paralyzed one side, and began talking so much about torture that my family and friends were freaked out. But it's an incredible and a terrible thing that in the first few years of the second millennium, that the United States would be able to have a discussion about the pros and cons of torture in a country that was founded on the principles of the Enlightenment and on the ideals that all people are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, and that among those rights are protection from cruel and unusual punishment. And it's not just people in America, but all people, because we're human, around the world. And so, thanks. I hope that's for the words of the founders. Then the question I get a lot is, what's a nice half-Jewish girl like me writing a book about torture for? And the way that I got into this was that I began in a small way, like many obsessions, by writing stories for the New Yorker magazine, where I'm a staff writer. And as I began writing these pieces, exploring kind of the underside of the war on terror, I began to get the sense that this was not an ordinary subject. There was something incredibly profound about it to me, and it was not just about how to keep America's security. It wasn't just a battle over security. It was becoming kind of a battle over the country's soul, about our history, our values, and where we draw the line in how we treat detainees. And I had to learn a lot about this subject, but when I did, I began to realize that we have a long history in this country, beginning with George Washington, of treating prisoners of war in ways that are admirable, and that starting from the very beginning, this was done deliberately because we were a new country in a new world with new values, and Washington in particular wanted to make a point to the British that we're going to try to do things in humane ways. And he did it for smart reasons, not just for moral reasons, but also because he realized that when you use cruelty, it cuts into military discipline and also becomes a recruiting tool for the other side, which is what's happened with, as we've seen in the war on terror, the pictures of things like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo are on every Al-Qaeda site that's to recruit young members. So it comes out to hurt us in the end. And so I started in on doing some stories for the New Yorker and realized that there was something very strange going on and very upsetting. And it began in some ways with a piece I did where I interviewed a man named Maher Arar, who is a Canadian citizen who told me I think I talked to him in early 2005, he's an engineer, that he was changing planes in JFK Airport in New York, coming back from a family holiday, when he was pulled aside and taken away by U.S. officials. He didn't know who they were. He was held for about 2 weeks without being able to see a lawyer, and then he was put on a plane of Gulfstream jet, a really, incredibly sleek, fancy one, where they showed movies on the way. And he did not know who the officials were. They were speaking English. He heard something about special removal unit, and he was flown eventually to Syria, where he spent the next year of his life in a subterranean cell that was about the size of a grave, where he was taken out, interrogated, and beaten with electric cables. And he was there for more than a year before his wife finally succeeded in getting him out of there. He was never allowed to see a lawyer. When he was finally released, the Syrians explained that he had never been a terrorist as far as they were concerned, and they're not exactly soft on this subject. They mentioned that the United States had asked for them to interrogate him in this way, and eventually he went back to Canada, and the Canadian government did an inquiry and found that he was cleared of all ties to terrorism. He was awarded $10 million in damages, but in the United States, he's still on our terror watch list, and you cannot really get the story still of how we got into this. I've just heard that they've reopened the investigation in the Justice Department, but we actually have a law in this country that says you can't deport someone to any country where there's more than a 50-50 chance that they might be tortured. And Syria appears on every list that the State Department has as a torture state. So how it was that this man who was innocent got into this situation became of interest to me. It was right about that time that President Bush said, we don't torture and we don't send people to other countries to be tortured. So I started digging a little deeper and discovered that what happened to Maher Arar was actually part of a program, an organized, very deliberate program that had been authorized from the very top of our government called Extraordinary Rendition, and that all over the world, these strange kidnappings were taking place where people were being snatched off the face of the earth, they were terror suspects, and being disappeared. Without due process, not facing charges, not facing trials, just plain being thrown into dungeons, usually in other countries where they use sort of forms of interrogation that would be illegal over here. That was the beginning of my inquiry. It just became stranger and stranger, and kind of like putting together this jigsaw puzzle where each piece began to fit into something else. I began to talk to U.S. officials about the program. There have been now about 125 or more of such renditions since 9/11. At least 7 of them, according to the CIA, are being investigated as innocent people who were renditioned. No charges have ever been brought against anyone. The officials that participate in this program often wear black hoods. No one knows who they are. There's no accountability. And what happened after the Arar case that was interesting was there was a change in policy where we stopped just sending these kinds of suspects to other countries for interrogation, and we started taking them ourselves into black site prisons around the world, which in some ways, according to the people I've interviewed at the CIA, was even worse, a bigger can of worms, as they were saying it, because they had no experience inside the CIA really of running prisons. They'd done all kinds of other things, but they had not run prisons, and they don't have really much experience in interrogation. At that point, I began also trying to figure out exactly what the program was for interrogation in these black sites and in Guantanamo. The Abu Ghraib pictures came out, and as a reporter, I was fascinated by the fact that there seemed to be the same kinds of things happening all around the world where the U.S. was holding prisoners. And I thought it couldn't possibly be just coincidence that there were people being hooded, shackled in the same ways, subjected to incredibly strange sounds, everything from cat food commercials where there were like meow meow sounds being played at them 24 hours a day, to babies crying, to actually there was research done, they found Yoko Ono's singing was one of the things that really breaks people down. I'm sorry if Yoko Ono hears this, but very effective apparently. It's psychological demolition. It was clear that there was a program of some sort, or it seemed to be. You know, we watched while people were prosecuted at Abu Ghraib for doing very similar things, and we were told by Rumsfeld, then the Secretary of State, that these were just a few bad apples at the bottom of the barrel. But it seemed to me too much of a coincidence that there was the same thing going on all around the world, in Iraq and Cuba. And so I started looking into it and then stumbled across what was actually a curriculum, it turned out. There was there is still a curriculum for torture that the U.S. used, and in the most ironic way possible, we got into this, which was, it's something called the SEER program. It's a training program that the U.S. uses for special forces mostly, and what it is a program where we subject our own armed forces to the kind of torture that they might possibly be subjected to if they were taken prisoner by the most immoral enemies in the world. It was sort of a petri dish where they've studied the kinds of tortures used in communist countries, particularly used to get people to give false confessions, ironically. And while it had been used always for defensive purposes before 9/11, after 9/11, the experts on the SEER program, in particular psychologists, became the people who wrote out the program for what we would do with our own prisoners. We wound up, in other words, copying the methods of the countries that we labeled the evil empire. And we also used methods that had been used specifically to get false confessions out of people in communist countries. And unsurprisingly, we wound up getting a lot of false confessions out of people in our own program, some of which I also began to understand led us into terrible false directions, including into the war in Iraq. There's one case about a man named Ibn Sheikh al-Libi that's just fascinating, because he was taken by the CIA, sent to Egypt where he was beaten up, and I think he was put in a tiny little dog cage for about 80 hours, and he wasn't sure he'd ever come out. They kept asking him about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It was right before the war, and they were looking for evidence. And he didn't know anything about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He was an al-Qaeda training person in Afghanistan. But he could see what they wanted, so he told them, yeah, there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and there are connections between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. It was just what the government wanted to hear. It was immediately piped right into Vice President Cheney's office, where an awful lot of this program originated. That information made its way directly into Colin Powell's speech at the UN, which was the speech in February 2003 that was really the turning point in convincing, I think, many people who were on the fence that we had to go to war. And almost exactly a year later, the same detainee, Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, recanted. There were no weapons of mass destruction, as the 9/11 Commission found, in Iraq. There were no serious connections between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. And they asked this man, well, why did you tell us this? And he said, I had to say something, they were killing me. So you can definitely, I've talked to an awful lot of people about this subject, and if you talk to experts, unlike the amateurs at the CIA, if you talk to people at the FBI, for instance, who've interrogated people for years, they'll tell you, you can pummel people into saying almost anything, but getting the truth is a really different issue. And we've managed to get a lot of bad information out of this program. In fact, somebody who is a very, very senior person at the CIA told me 90% of what we've gotten is crap. So it's been at a very high price, I think. And I could go on and on, I don't want to, but I did want to end by saying that while it's a shame to have to write a book like this, on the other hand, I think it's a tremendous privilege to be able to be in a country where you can write about such terrible things and have an open debate about it and have an election like the last election. And I wanted to close by reading just a tiny fragment of a bit from Hannah Arendt from her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. I don't view what the U.S. did as equivalent by any means. I don't mean to say that we are the Third Reich. This is not on that scale at all. It is a violation of many of our ideals, but it's not at that level. But I wanted to read what she said, which was that that the goals of police states are to create holes of oblivion into which all deeds, good and evil, disappear. So that is, and she says that the job of writers, their duty is to rescue that history, to descend into those holes and recount especially the individual acts of heroism so that they can be told to our children and passed on. And what I tried to do in this book was not just write about what went wrong, but I wanted to write a lot about, there are an awful lot of heroes who stood up to this program, and they are people of all political points of view. There are a lot of conservative lawyers, there are people in the FBI, there are a lot of soldiers, top-level people, including the top lawyer at the Navy, Alberto Mora, who's a Cuban-American, who said, we're better than this. We are not going in that direction. And so what Arendt was saying was that that we need to pass the stories on of the people who've stood up in this way. She says, it's beyond expectation that everyone will be a hero or resist tyranny, but it's enough, humanly speaking, for the planet to remain a place fit for human habitat that a few would stand up. And so I wanted to tell their story in this book, too.
Thank you all for being here. That's actually a very apt introduction for my comments, because my book is actually about two of these heroes who emerged from this. And like Jane's book, it grew out of magazine work, in my case at the New York Times Magazine. And it began with a story I wrote back in the spring of 2004. And it was a profile of a naval officer who was also a JAG lawyer, Lieutenant Commander Charles Swift was his name. And I was sent down to Washington to spend some time with him and to profile him, because he had just been essentially plucked from anonymity in the JAG Corps and assigned to a new unit at the Pentagon that had been created to serve as the defense team for the first defendants to be tried in military tribunals in America since World War II. So these were going to be these historic military tribunals where we were going to try certain, authorized by the president, where we were going to try certain enemy combatants in the war on terror. And of course, they needed lawyers to defend these guys. And they reached out to the JAG Corps and chose this man, Lieutenant Commander Charles Swift, to be one of the lawyers. And at the time I met him, he'd actually just been assigned a client, and his client was named Salam Hamdan, and Hamdan was a driver, had admitted to being a driver for Osama bin Laden. Now, when I embarked on this story, my assumption, and really the public's assumption, was that Swift, as a Navy officer, would essentially do what the government wanted him to do. And as Swift put it to me at the time, to roll over and have my belly scratched. Now, the government what the government wanted Swift to do was essentially tell his client, Hamdan, to plead guilty, to appear at this military tribunal and plead guilty. So that was what the government was assuming would happen. And in fact, they were so confident that it would happen that when they assigned Swift to represent Hamdan, the letter, his detailing letter, appointing him to represent Hamdan, told him that he could meet with his client under the condition that he was negotiating a guilty plea. So the deck was stacked against him from the start. Now, it quickly became clear to me that this was not Swift's intention at all. Not only was Swift planning to defend Hamdan on the facts of the case, which is to say he was going to argue that, yes, he was a driver for Osama bin Laden, but that he was in no way involved in the al-Qaeda conspiracy, had no knowledge or hadn't participated in any way in any of the activities of al-Qaeda. In fact, he was basically just an uneducated Yemeni who found his way there and was working there. So he was not only going to make that argument, he was going to go a big step further. He was actually going to sue the Bush administration. He was going to sue his commander-in-chief on behalf of this guy, arguing that this very system, these military tribunals, this very system that his client was to be tried in was illegal. And to do that, now Swift was a great trial lawyer in the JAG Corps, had spent many years defending wayward servicemen of all sorts of petty crimes, but he was by no means a constitutional lawyer. So to do that, he recruited a young Indian-American law professor at Georgetown University named Neil Katyal, and together they represented Hamdan. Now, my story was published this first story was published back in June, as it was in 2004. And the headline of the story was Commander Swift Objects. And I realized at that point that I really was at the beginning of what could prove to be an interesting story. So I started continuing to follow it, wrote some more stories about it, and began working on this book. And what sort of quickly emerged, or gradually emerged, I guess I would say, is that there were sort of two separate narrative threads. And one was the story of Swift and Hamdan. And just to tell you a little bit more about Hamdan, he was a man who had grown up in a tribal region of Yemen, in southeastern Yemen, very poor. His parents were farmers and died when he was very young. He was 11 when his parents died. So he was orphaned, and he sort of drifted around Yemen, had the equivalent of about a fourth grade education. And ultimately, kind of in his early 20s, found his way to the capital city in Yemen, Sana'a, where he thought he might have a better chance at finding a job, but he was uneducated, and so instead he found himself sort of driving a taxi part-time and sleeping on a dirty mattress in a crowded boarding house. And he was there recruited for jihad, and eventually kind of made his way to bin Laden with a group of other jihadis in 1996, and worked for bin Laden for a number of years, as I said, as a driver. There's no evidence, and not even the government has argued that he ever was anything more than that. But in the aftermath of 9/11, he was, of course, captured and kept in Afghanistan in a couple of different prisons, interrogated dozens of times over the course of about, brutally interrogated in certain cases, over the course of about 6 months before being sent to Guantanamo Bay, where he was for about another year and a half, several months of which he spent in solitary confinement, before into his cell one day walks a man in a military uniform saying, "My name is Lieutenant Commander Charles Swift, and I'm here to help you." So thus begins this really extraordinary relationship between a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, a lifelong officer of the U.S. Navy and Navy lawyer, and a suspected terrorist. And Swift would dutifully go down to Guantanamo every month and spend several days with Hamdan when Hamdan would agree to see him, because often Hamdan would refuse to allow him in his cell, would refuse to talk to him. And because Hamdan was spent so much time in solitary confinement, he really had no one to vent to, no one to blame except Swift. So he was at times very nasty to Swift, and he fired him on numerous occasions. But Swift had to hang in there, and even after being fired, he would go back down and try to get Hamdan to speak with him. And ultimately, Hamdan always would, though it would sometimes require several separate trips. And of course, the other challenge that Swift was facing with Hamdan was that Hamdan was of course sort of despairing, was constantly losing hope about that he was ever going to get off of Guantanamo Bay, and he went on numerous hunger strikes. At one point, had to be force-fed in a restraining chair, and again, it was Swift who had to go down there and convince him that he had to keep himself alive, that he had to hold out hope that someday he would return to Yemen and see his family. And so it really was a remarkable relationship, and they became very close over the years. So in the book, I sort of track that relationship, and I also go into detail about the legal case, which is sort of the second narrative story here. And that story begins with the lawsuit that they filed in 2004, the lawsuit known as Hamdan versus Rumsfeld. And it argued essentially that these military tribunals were illegal. And they were illegal for a couple of different reasons. The first being that President Bush had unilaterally authorized them in the aftermath of 9/11. He had issued a military order saying, I'm authorizing the Pentagon to create these trials, to write the rules for the trials, the procedures. There will be no appeals to any federal courts. In other words, the federal courts will have no oversight over this. Congress will have no oversight over this. So the first sort of arm of their lawsuit argued that that's illegal. The president does not have the power to do that. And furthermore, the lawsuit went on to argue that essentially the rules of these trials were unfair. And they were unfair because they failed to live up to guarantees provided by the Geneva Conventions and a body of law known as the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So they filed their lawsuit, and to just give you some sense of how unlikely it seemed when they first filed the lawsuit, at the time, the Bush administration was arguing, and to great effect in the federal court system, that the federal courts actually had no right to hear cases from Guantanamo Bay. And indeed, that's the reason why the government chose Guantanamo Bay, not because it's warm and sunny, but because they believed that it was outside the jurisdiction of the federal courts. So this was the first obstacle they were up against. They were able to clear that obstacle, and their lawsuit did get traction. And I follow it as it sort of proceeds through the federal court system, and they actually won a huge victory at the lower court, at the federal court, and a federal judge, a district judge in Washington, D.C., halted the pretrial hearings of the military tribunals as they were going on Guantanamo Bay. I was on Guantanamo Bay when the judge indefinitely halted the proceedings because a federal judge had told the president they were illegal. Well, as it turned out, they lost the case at the Court of Appeals, and then their last resort, of course, was the Supreme Court. And to give you a sense of how unlikely getting a hearing at the Supreme Court was, the Supreme Court gets on the order of about 8,000 petitions for review a year, and they hear about 100 cases. So the numbers alone were daunting, but the Supreme Court is historically especially wary of hearing cases that involve having to weigh in on what kind of power the president has to keep the country safe during times of armed conflict. So there was every reason to believe they weren't going to get a hearing at all. As it turned out, they did, after months of deliberation, months of arguments, internal arguments inside the Supreme Court. A majority of the justices decided that they would hear the case. And now, of course, the question became, well, who's going to argue it? Because there's 80% of the arguments delivered at the Supreme Court are given by lawyers, advocates, who've argued at least a dozen cases at the court. There's a a group of Supreme Court advocates who do this for a living. But the young Georgetown law professor, who was 35 years old at the time, whom I mentioned, wanted to be the one to argue the case himself. He had devoted, at this point, several years of his life to it, around the clock, and he didn't want to let the argument go. And so over the objections of virtually everyone whom he spoke to, every Supreme Court advisor, everyone inside and outside their legal team, he insisted that he was going to argue this case. And so he felt that the only way he could do that was to just prepare obsessively. And so what he did is he took out a legal pad and he wrote down the names of the 15 lawyers and law professors around the country who most intimidated him. Now, this was a young man who graduated at the very top of his class at Yale Law School, had clerked on the Supreme Court for Justice Breyer, and was now a law professor at this esteemed law school, Georgetown, and yet he had his list of 15 lawyers and law professors, and he called each and every one of these lawyers and law professors and asked them if they would moot him, if they would grill him. And he flew all around the country and did dozens of moot courts in front of these mock judges to prepare for the argument. He also kept a copy of the entire case record, hundreds and hundreds of pages, next to his bed. And before he fell asleep at night, he would study the entire case record because he wanted to commit the entire thing to memory. In the event that during the argument, if one of the justices said, "Oh, well, Mr. Katyal, where can I find this charge that you're referring to?" he wanted to be able to not cite merely the page, but the specific paragraph on that page from memory. And as it turned out, this actually happened during the argument. Justice Stevens asked him where he could find something, and he directed him to that very paragraph on the very page. So the other thing, the last thing I'll mention that he did was he knew, he was aware that he was a little stiff. He was a law professor. He had no courtroom experience. He had argued 3 cases in his life, one of which was a traffic ticket. Another was a landlord-tenant dispute in law school. So he knew he had to work on his presentation. So he agreed to work with a touchy-feely trial consultant who had him line up all of his son's stuffed animals and practice making eye contact with them as if they were the justices. And he also told him, he insisted that on the morning of the argument, he get up early and in the shower, he sing. And he sing in a full voice so that when he found himself standing before the justices, the sound of his own voice didn't make him self-conscious. Well, as it turned out, he didn't want to wake his wife up on the morning of the argument, so he didn't sing in the shower. He realized that he had forgotten to do so. So 15 minutes before the argument began, he ducked into the bathroom of the lawyer's lounge at the Supreme Court and belted out the words to the only song that he could think of the lyrics for, which happened to be Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He then proceeded to deliver what experts agree is really one of the greatest Supreme Court arguments of that term. And they won the case. And they didn't win just a narrow victory. Often the Supreme Court likes to decide cases very narrowly. They don't want to make sweeping judgments if they can avoid it. But this was a sweeping judgment. And what this judgment said was not only that these military tribunals were illegal, and that if the president did indeed want to do them, he could not do it without the cooperation and input from Congress, without legislation from Congress. But the court went a step further. The court also said that the president does not have the authority to violate the laws and treaties of the United States, even during wartime. Now, that may sound self-evident, but as Jane was saying before, the Bush administration, many of the Bush administration's policies in the war on terror were built on this assumption, as it turned out, false assumption, that the president could, if he felt necessary during a time of war, violate the laws and treaties of the United States. So that's what gave us programs like the Extraordinary Rendition Program that Jane was talking about. It's also what led to the Secret Surveillance Program, the warrantless wiretapping. So, needless to say, this decision, the Hamdan decision, created a great panic inside the Bush administration, and it also necessitated legislation on these military tribunals. Well, Congress and the president went back and forth and eventually came to some sort of agreement, and new trial rules were drawn up, were passed into law. Many people still believe that they're inadequate, but nevertheless, after 7 years in American custody, Hamdan went on trial last summer, And a jury of military officers heard his case, acquitted him altogether on the most serious charge brought against him. And the government was asking that this panel of military officers sentence him to somewhere between 30 years and life in prison. As it turned out, this panel of military officers decided he should be sentenced to, after time served, 5 months. So Hamdan is scheduled to be released now at the end of December. And the last thing I'll say, and I will end on a similar note to Jane, is that there's been a great deal of criticism of the Bush administration's policies in the war on terror, and we've heard a lot of them here on this panel, and many of them are certainly justified. But actually, that's not the story I tell in this book. That's not what this book is about. To me, this book is actually about really the greatness of this country and the fact that these two men, one a Navy officer, another a child of immigrants, could bring a lawsuit against the commander-in-chief, the President of the United States, have that lawsuit heard in the highest court in the country, and win, and change the course of history in doing so, to me actually says great things about the resilience of American values and the resilience of our Constitution and the durability of our Constitution. And one last thing I'll say, which is that it's actually Lieutenant Commander Swift put it better than I can when he said, in most countries, when a military officer challenges his commander-in-chief, it's called a coup. In the United States, it's called Hamdan v. Rumsfeld.
Now comes time for questions and discussion, and while the questioners are lining up, I have something that I would like to start them off with, which is the question of where do we go from here? How do we unwind certain aspects of the bureaucratic, military, and legal cultures that have sprung up, albeit they're very recent growths, but they still take hold, and they're going to have to be unwound. And I'd like to know, where do we go from here? How is it going to be done? How can the new administration do anything? Bureaucracies don't turn on a dime.
Yes.
Well, let me start with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, because when you look closely at the foreign policy of the Republican and the Democratic parties, there really isn't a lot of difference. Both John McCain and Barack Obama have called during the campaign for an extension of the war in Afghanistan, which I think is a disastrous mistake. One wonders if they've read anything about the 10-year Soviet effort to subdue Afghanistan, 100,000 Red Army soldiers, 15,000 dead, or go back and look at the disastrous attempts by the British to control Afghanistan in the 19th century. It is not a country that culturally or geographically has ever lent itself to foreign occupation, and I think we've seen in the last 7 years a disastrous slippage. The Taliban, when we went into Afghanistan, controlled 75% of the country. They today control half of Afghanistan. Most Westerners can't go outside of the city limits, places like Kandahar. And as the Afghan Taliban has become resurgent, there has been, by the way, a correlating resurgence of the poppy trade, of the heroin trade, which the Taliban provides security protection for the poppy growers, imposes war taxes, and this funds the insurgency. And you just saw the other day another wedding party was destroyed by aerial bombing. Because it's a vast country, because much of it is remote, because there is a resurgent Taliban, we are resorting more and more to air power, which is probably the most potent recruiting weapon the Taliban has. In terms of Iraq, there's a kind of, Barack Obama has proposed a kind of downsizing and a removal of some combat brigades, which he, I think, disastrously would like to transfer to Afghanistan, but he wants to retain American control of the airport, of our imperial city in the center of Baghdad, the Green Zone, and of the 3 super bases. He wants to leave, anyone's guess is, between 50 and 60,000 troops behind to train Iraqi soldiers, and these are his words, to fight terrorism. I think that for those of us who have spent as long as I have in the Middle East, there are 2 components. One, you know, that the imposition of force is doomed to failure. The decline in violence that we see in Iraq is not due to the surge, it's due to the fact that there are 100,000 Sunni insurgents who now receive monthly salaries of $300 a month from U.S. taxpayers not to kill American soldiers. And we don't own these people, we only rent them. We tried the same thing with tribal groups in the Taliban, and when they got enough money and weapons, they went right back into the arms of the Taliban. So I think it's important for us to be very clear-headed that the codification by the Bush administration of these illegal wars of aggression, and under post-Nuremberg laws, these are criminal wars of aggression. We have no right under international law to debate the terms of the occupation. And my fear is that that codification of illegal preemptive war is something that is going to be carried over with disastrous consequences for us in the Middle East, and ultimately disastrous consequences for the Obama administration itself. And one hopes that there is a kind of realization. I think there would be a tragic result of this misguided policy would be that Obama sort of ends up like LBJ, at one time sort of wanting the Great Society and being sucked down by the morass of Vietnam. So I think it's important for those of us who realize that we ultimately are faced with only 2 options in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that is an orderly or phased withdrawal or a collapse of the mission, to begin to agitate as hard as we can for total withdrawal of American troops from Iraq and Afghanistan.
In terms of some of the other legal policies in the war on terror, I feel we're at a turning point where we don't necessarily know how it's going to come out. So maybe I'm a little less optimistic than Jonathan. There are going to be some serious problems to work out. Down in Guantanamo, you've got people down there who have been taken outside of the rule of law, where you really can't very easily bring them back inside the rule of law. Specifically, you've got people like Mohammed al-Qahtani, who was supposed to be the 20th hijacker, who was tortured for months on end. They recently had to drop charges against him because any defense lawyer representing him would be able to say he'd been tortured. And the transcript of his interrogation ran in Time magazine, and you read it and you know that he's got the kind of defense that would get him off, and yet he is supposed to be the 20th hijacker. So what do you do with a case like that? It just illustrates how much those shortcuts that they took have ended up hurting the country's ability to really win the war on terror, which they really have to do, I think, by winning the hearts and minds of the next generation of young Muslims. And you can't really do that by torturing people's relatives. So I think it's going to be a tough question. It's also a tough question about what the American public wants to happen in terms of accountability for the war crimes that were committed over the last 7 years. There definitely, I'm not a lawyer, but any lawyer you talk to who understands this area will say there have been a lot of war crimes committed. And, do we want to hold the public officials accountable for this, or do we want to let them off? It's a tough issue, and I think it's going to rest in all of your laps. It all depends what the public wants, really, and asks for.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think you're absolutely right about Guantanamo. President-elect Obama is already, of course, talking about his intention to close Guantanamo, but it's going to be very complicated because there are a number of people there whom he is not going to want to release, who are going to be very difficult. He's not going to do these military tribunals, and they're going to be virtually impossible to try in federal courts. So what can he do? He has 2 options, neither of which are great, and neither of which are popular. One is to create these new special national security courts, which will have those same issues of legitimacy as these military tribunals, this sort of made-up legal system. And the other would be to go to Congress and ask for some sort of new legislation allowing him to continue to detain people. And that too is of course, a dubious proposition. So you're right. I mean, Guantanamo is going to be a very difficult issue for him. As for the question of accountability, I think I think Jane is right, and I think the question is really going to be one for Congress. That I think that we saw, unfortunately, during the Bush years, that Congress wasn't willing to stand up to the president, wasn't willing to perform its constitutional obligation to provide vigorous oversight of the executive branch and to investigate, to issue subpoenas when necessary, to do what needs to be done. And I think we have to hope that the new Congress will want to take this on. There are already some investigations going. I know the SEER program that Jane talked about a little earlier, Senator Levin of Michigan is in the midst of a serious investigation into that. And we have to hope that there will be more and that they will be serious, and that the truth is that the sort of the difficult situation that we're in right now, in two wars and in a financial crisis, won't prevent Congress from making sure that they get to the bottom of everything that went on, because it's going to be critical for the historical record.
As far as the Iraq War, I just want to say very quickly where to go from here. The Iraqi refugee crisis is definitely something that will take years and years to resolve. It's the largest refugee population in the world now, and at 5 million, and I think we as a country have fallen short as far as doing our part in giving these refugees a new home after creating the situation they're in now.
Thank you.
Yes.
You've waited long enough for your question, please.
There were two documentaries, film documentaries, that have come out in the last year or so. One was Earl Morris's SOP about Abu Ghraib, and the other was Alex Gibney, I forget the last name, Gibney something, Taxi to the Dark Side. Now, and then of course there were several films that were non-fiction, although based on reality. None of them were seen by too many Americans. Now, what I'm getting at is there any hope that there's going to be a significant change in attitude to the American public, so they can give the kind of momentum that will be necessary if Congress or the new Attorney General is willing to open up this great can of worms, because it's going to be very, very difficult to do. And unless you have substantial American support from the populace, I don't see how it will happen. Ms. Mayor, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I have to say, as a political reporter, I don't see a groundswell of interest in moving in that direction. I think, if anything, people are in a mood to move on and maybe, sweep these things under the rug. If anything, it's interesting, the place where there might be action, things percolating legally against our own officials is actually elsewhere in the world. In Britain recently, a criminal investigation was opened up into the CIA's treatment of a British citizen who was renditioned to Morocco, among other places. And the rest of the world is more inflamed about this than maybe we are here at home.
Next question.
Yes, I've heard a lot today, and it would appear as though we have leaders that are murderers and thieves, and it has gotten very well absorbed by all of our systems. And the question is really, what does that say about us as a people, American citizens, and what is it that American citizens, what can we do besides vote to really try to get this thing under control, just in your opinions?
Well, I think the problem is that we who care about maintaining the open society no longer have moral imperatives that cannot be crossed. And because of that, the Democratic Party, I think in many ways, is as much to blame for the deterioration of the rule of law and democratic values as the Republican Party. The passage of FISA, which for those of us who communicate frequently with the Middle East is disastrous. The FISA Reform Act, which Barack Obama, by the way, voted for, squelches some 30 lawsuits in lower courts that were working their way up that would have challenged the telecommunications companies. Of course, the communication companies pumped anywhere from $10 to $15 million into lobbying efforts to make sure that they were granted immunity, and the Bush administration retroactively, illegal activities carried out by the Bush administration were made legal. The list goes on and on. The fact that Democrats were elected in 2006 to stop the war and then never continued to fund, not only continued to fund the war, but actually supported troop increases in Iraq. So I think that, we have to begin to make the Democratic Party, if you're a Democrat or a Republican Party, I mean, it was interesting on the bailout because some of the most eloquent responses, especially in the House, came from the Republican side of the House. But I think we, as voters, have to begin to have moral imperatives, and we have to be willing to step outside the two-party system when those moral imperatives are challenged.
Well, we heard a number of extraordinary stories today, including extraordinary rendition, and I think we have to look back at this extraordinary 2-year presidential campaign that didn't mention any of these stories, and take a look at us. And I think, thanks for what you just said, Mr. Hedges, because unless we take extraordinary steps to find some 10 or 15 or 20 or 25% of our lives to make this happen, if we just go back home and sit and watch on the tube, I don't think any of it's going to change. We need to give it that imperative. I want to know how you feel about it. You already started to say that. I wonder how the others feel about that, what we can do.
Well, you can buy books about it. No, I mean, I think that you can show. No, I honestly think that you're right. I mean, it was absent from the campaign was discussion of these issues. Absent from the campaign was discussion of the whole issue of presidential power and the abuses of presidential power during the Bush administration. And I think all we can do is and all you can do and all of us can do as part of the public is to just to sort of be engaged on these issues and to ask questions and to demand answers. And I think, again, I would go back to Congress. I mean, I think people have to insist that their congressmen, that they don't let this stuff go. And that's that. And then we have to let the system handle the rest. I mean,
let me just say it wasn't absent from the campaign. It was raised by candidates like Dennis Kucinich, Cynthia McKinney, Ralph Nader. But these candidates were denied a voice by a corporatized media that did not want these issues discussed, whether it was extraordinary rendition or the offshore penal colonies we run where we openly torture human beings who are stripped of legal rights, whether it's universal single-payer, not-for-profit health care, whether it's the bailout, which 100-to-1 constituents did not want and they passed anyway because the financial service sectors did want it. The issues were raised. But I think we have to seriously begin to examine to what extent this two-party duopoly essentially shut those discussions out. I mean, in the debates in New Hampshire, Tim Russert asked all of the Democratic candidates if any of them could guarantee that we would be out of Iraq by 2012, and nobody, including John Edwards, would make that guarantee. And the one Democratic candidate who was willing to make that guarantee, Kucinich, was standing outside on a snowbank with his protesters because he'd been locked out of the debate. And I think that when we shut down that debate, I'll be frank with you, I voted for Nader. When we shut down that debate, we diminish ourselves as a democracy, and we have to begin to find a new militancy, because what we are undergoing through our shadow corporate government is a kind of coup d'etat in slow motion.
Yes, next. Okay, as As the voice of corporatized media at the New Yorker magazine owned by the Advance Company, I actually think that, that some of the so-called mainstream media have done an amazing job reporting on the subject that I've been reporting on. You've got the
I would agree
Washington
with
Post breaking story after story with Dana Priest and other people about the black sites. You've got the New York Times, which you would never have known about the wiretapping story if not for James Risen at the New York Times. There have been some great mainstream media reporters and editors standing up to a very intimidating government at some points. And I also think that, you know, that, I mean, it was at least in the area of torture, it was, again, Tim Russert who did, in fact, ask the candidates about where they stood on that. And part of the reason there was not a debate, which was amazing to me watching this, was because both of the nominees of their parties, both McCain and Obama, have spoken out very forcefully against torture. So they didn't even have a difference on this subject. They were both very much in a different place from Bush, which I think is good news. I mean, and there's a long way to go. You could look at it as half empty or half full, but I think there's a lot to be optimistic about compared to where we were when I started covering this stuff 5 years ago. So.
That's right. We wouldn't know about any of these scandals without the media, really. I mean, the Bush administration deliberately obscured, protected this information the same way that they, kept it from Congress, they kept it from the media, and yet the mainstream media, the corporatized media, I think, did an extraordinary job. I mean, again, the warrantless wiretapping story. Today, we may still not know about a secret surveillance program going on in the United States were it not for the reporting of the New York Times. So, I don't think we can blame the media for this at all.
Can I add one thing, which is, again, about why it rests back in your laps, is because I talked to Chuck Schumer at one point, who's the senator from New York, and said to him, why aren't you speaking up more about torture and civil liberties? And he said, my constituents don't care about it. So if they feel their constituents don't care, they are going to be spineless.
Yes, next, please.
Thank you, all of you, for your vital and necessary work. The question I have is a forward-looking one. There's been some support, as you could gather, from Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela for the new president, which made me think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of South Africa. How vital do you think, or how valid do you think those are as a model going forward, perhaps in lancing this boil and coming up with solutions for the future?
Well, the model that I think of is the Church Committee post Watergate, post Nixon. I mean, to me, that's what needs to happen now. We need to have an incredibly aggressive congressional investigation that will lead wherever it leads, but it needs to and the problem is that it's going to be these claims of executive privilege are going to become very sticky, and there are going to be lots of long, difficult legal battles over what information the administration, what will be the former administration, will be compelled to turn over, and certainly the Congress has made that more difficult by passing that FISA bill, which granted retroactive immunity to all the telecom executives who won't have to tell, will never know whose phones were tapped and why, and what was done with that information because of the FISA bill. So, nevertheless, I mean, to me, that's the model that I think about, that sort of just sort of sweeping, hundreds and hundreds of interviews and subpoenas and everything that sort of needed to be done to find out exactly who ordered what when, and if there is if someone is subject to prosecution, then prosecute them.
I mean, I think there's, it's obvious there's political peril for Obama in pushing for prosecutions. He doesn't want to look like he's on a partisan witch hunt and looking backwards with all the problems they've got now. But I got to say, at the same time, and I can understand that. I'm somewhat torn on this myself because I've interviewed people at the CIA who said to me, they personally refused to get involved in this program because they thought it was a slippery slope and it was going to end up with hearings in front of Congress and people going to jail. So if nobody does go to jail and there are no hearings in front of Congress, where's the deterrent?
That's right. You basically are. Yeah, you're incentivizing if the argument that the president is basically allowed during wartime to do whatever he needs to do is allowed to, if there are no prosecutions, then you're basically incentivizing future presidents to do the exact same thing and to say, well, you know, we have a precedent for this. I was doing it in the interest of national security, and that's that. So that's right. I think that's the danger, obviously, of not taking this a step further.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very much. That concludes our program. The authors will be signing copies of their books in the designated area. Thanks again.